is now to start the recording. Right, the first item on the agenda is apologies. We have one from Michael Locke. Disclosures of interest, are there any? No? Okay, thank you. Prohibition of whip votes and declaration of party whips? No. The minutes of the previous meeting, which was the 16th of July, and page 1, page 2. Very brief, as you know. Do you all agree they're a true record? Yes, thank you very much. Public question time. Have we had any public questions? We haven't had any public questions. Right, so do we all know everybody, by the way? I think you all know David Hopkins. Do you know the gentleman sitting next to him? Do you want to introduce yourself before you speak?
Thank you. Yes, I'm Elian Jones. I'm a team leader in the development management section of the planning department, and I will be covering one of the items here today.
Thank you. We've got the update on planning enforcement for nature and biodiversity. So who's going to speak first? Is it you, David?
If I could just start by giving an apology for Ian. Ian's not with us today. He's on lucky enough he's on holiday somewhere. I'm going to say with better weather, but I don't know. We're blessed with some weather at the moment as well. So no, I got nothing to add to the report. I know the report is before us. And we've had the questions prior to it. So I'll just hand over to Elian just to take us through the report if he can.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so in October 2023, this panel considered a report on the planning enforcement, nature and biodiversity, and a copy is attached in the Appendix 1 of the report before you today. So the panel requested an update to that report to provide further information on 4 matters, and the report before you today has considered those items. Those 4 matters are specified on page 3 of the report that's before you today. And I'll go through a summary of those, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end. So with regards to the first matter, Planning Policy Wales was updated in February 2024, which provides a stronger emphasis on biodiversity and ecology matters. The report explains that there is now a requirement for planning applications to be accompanied by a green infrastructure statement, which describes how green infrastructure has been incorporated into the proposal. Proposals are also required to demonstrate a net benefit for biodiversity. The Council offers a pre-application advice service, and it will be explained to those who engages with us that there is a need to address ecology, biodiversity and green infrastructure requirements as part of any subsequent formal application. With regards to the second matter that's been raised, the report explains that the Council has provided supplementary planning guidance on biodiversity, which provides advice on how various policies can be addressed. It is often the case that planning permissions are issued with conditions, which requires ecology and biodiversity mitigation, compensation or enhancements to be provided. With regards to the third matter, the Council does provide guidance on planning and biodiversity, and this is through the supplementary planning guidance and the pre-application advice service, for example. Planning permissions are issued with conditions which can relate to a wide range of environmental matters, and the report references a condition for the submission of a construction environmental management plan, which ensures that the site is developed in a sensitive manner that respects the surrounding environment. The final matter relates to whether local planning authorities can insist on certain energy efficient and climate responsive measures being incorporated into new developments. The report explains that local planning policies must conform to national planning policies, and introducing prescriptive requirements on a local policy level that is not laid out at national policy level is unlikely to be considered possible. The report also acknowledges that there are other non-planning legislation in place which is better placed to deal with this, such as building regulations, and that planning should not duplicate legislation. The report concludes that the local planning authority already has a range of policies and guidelines which require developers to address the issues of biodiversity and ensure protection of the environment. In addition, other legislation seeks to ensure that development is energy efficient and sustainable. The combined effect of all these legislative strands is to ensure that biodiversity and sustainability are integral parts of the development process. So I hope this provides you with a summary of the report, and I will now answer some of the questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything you want to say, Councillor Hopkins?
Obviously, we are at a very critical time within Swansea with the new development of the LDP, and I give a commitment, particularly going forward, that part of the new LDP will obviously take into account everything that is legislative, but not just that, but all our aims locally to try to make biodiversity a huge gain, not just in the planning process, but in everything we do as an authority. So I'm quite excited about that. And I know that we've got a working group that's going to meet very shortly. But I think it's an ideal opportunity for us very shortly to look at the LDP in the process and what that can do and what that can bring for us. So we've nothing to add to the report. I think Elon's taken us through it very well. So just thank him for that.
Thank you very much. So we'll go through the questions that we have already submitted from our pre-meeting. The first one's from myself, and as you can see, Councillor Hopkins gave a commitment that he would come back to us. Have you got any update, please?
Yeah, it's an ongoing process at the moment, trying to get more publicity and more, highlight the good actions, the good work that we do. I've got no update at this particular time, but I will circulate, particularly with the new LDP, the opportunities we got, particularly when that comes forward, what we can do, particularly with our local comms team. So I've got no update on the process at the moment.
Thank you. So the next one is Councillor Keaton, if you'd like to ask a question. You're on mute, Sarah. You're on mute.
Sorry, apologies. Yes, we're concerned about all the trouble that's caused while builders are actually building the properties, and we understand it's difficult to watch them. So I was wondering whether or not we could get training relevant to both biodiversity and actually put in to the building. We've done very good practices with our Swansea, our standard building. Why can't that be just taught in building when they are learning to build, so that they understand about future sustainability and biodiversity? Would that be a possibility? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, good question. Okay, paragraph 2.6 of the report, which I think is related to your question, refers to developers to be more mindful of the environment whilst building. The report explained that the planning system has a degree of control by imposing conditions on planning permissions, and that this can mitigate the impact of the development on the environment. And there are also enforcement powers available to investigate when there's breaches of planning control, for example, not complying with a condition. So the matter does have some policing in place through the planning process, but is largely a reactive situation and is often challenging due to the limited resources that we have available. Notwithstanding this, the report highlights that protecting many aspects of the environment is covered by a raft of legislation, not just those focused on the planning side. Obviously, the planning system has a component in overall of that, but there are much wider legislation in place to deal with a variety of environmental factors. And this can include input by Natural Resources Wales, the police, for example, by the Wildlife Crime Prevention Officer, and pollution control when we deal with, if there's pollution leaking into the environment. In terms of the second aspect about training, yeah, this is something that may assist in terms of builders being mindful of the environment. But I am aware that there is a forum set up between the planning authority and local planning agents, not necessarily builders, but planning agents, which allows various planning matters to be discussed, such as the requirement for things like green infrastructure statements. So that is something that does fed to planning agents, where planning agents then can liaise with the builders who actually construct any buildings that's involved. In terms of ecology, often on large sites, developers will actively employ ecologists to be present at various stages of the development, and they sometimes undertake a toolbox talk to all the staff to discuss site-specific ecological constraints and make them aware of the legislative duties and establish appropriate working practices. That is not something that's necessarily done by the council. It's something done on a site-by-site specific requirement by the private contractor on that. I'm not aware that there is any direct training at the moment offered by the council to builders and developers on being mindful of the environment during development. But because it's a really broad subject which overlaps so many departments, it may be a little bit logistical difficult to formulate an appropriate training package, and that each site presents its own unique environmental constraints. Furthermore, there are some resource implications associated with creating that kind of package. But notwithstanding this, there are valuable resources available on the council's website, particularly with regards to biodiversity and ecology, and the supplementary planning guidance on biodiversity and development, the trees, hedgerows and woodlands, and information relating to wildlife and law. So the planning department is doing what it can to facilitate the relationship between developers and builders on the environment. But that is only one part of an overall process involving construction in its entirety and the broad nature of the environment. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Keaton, are you happy with the response?
Well, thank you for that. Yes, I do understand there's problems, and I think it's something we're going to have to boot up to Westminster really, rather than just to the council, because I can understand funding and everything, but I still think that the problem starts with the training, and if you've got training that actually encourages it from the get-go, you get people who are far more aware that this is good practice. Until it's not even good practice, it's just practice is what they do. And I think until we do that, we're always going to have these problems. But thank you very much.
I have a question, actually. We seem to be mainly talking about large sites. You did make the comment about large sites, but a single dwelling, obviously the same applies to them, but how aware, as a small builder, aware that they have to do these things? And I did have another question about it, which I've completely forgotten, but I'm sure when you've answered the first one, I'll remember the second one.
Okay. Yeah, you're 100% right that biodiversity has implications on smaller developments than larger ones as well. It's generally that the smaller developments, that the risk factor when you're dealing with ecology and biodiversity tends to be less. It's either less of a development in terms of physical development, and you're unlikely to encounter those sensitive designations when you're dealing with smaller sites. But there's still that responsibility on the developer and the construction and the builders as part of that process. And things such as the green infrastructure requirements, that will apply for a small scale development to a large scale development. But the Planning Policy Wales has made it fairly clear that it's got to be something that's proportionate to the scale and nature of the development. So we can't be over prescriptive or putting onerous tasks for a small scale developer compared to a large scale developer, because it's got to be proportionate to the scale and nature of that development. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've remembered the second question now. It's about the training. I mean, a lot of the, I hope, builders and trades go through some kind of college course, you know. Should we then perhaps, you know, approach, or whoever it needs to, approach colleges and tell them that this should be part of the training? If it's not the council's responsibility, if it's going to be private developers, but they should come out of their training from wherever with the knowledge that they should be abiding by these rules.
I think that's a fair point, because construction these days goes beyond just bricks and mortar, doesn't it? You've got to consider a raft of issues. Certainly, people who wants to be employed as the site foreman or site manager, they would probably be the more responsible on the whole operations across the whole site, rather than just the bricklayer, for example. And yes, I would imagine that courses for somebody who wants to be a site foreman, a site manager, would certainly have to widen, not just the physical attributes, but also the health and safety aspects and the biodiversity and ecology. And I think that's a fair point, Chair.
Thank you. As Councillor Evans isn't here, I'm trying to remember. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Who's got the hand up? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Councillor Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, got a couple of questions, if I may. First one, obviously,
Sorry,
the big
sorry, Councillor Thomas, is it on what we've just discussed?
No, it's not.
No, we've got a list of questions
No problem.
first that we've spoken, we've done in the pre-meeting, and then I'll open it out to general questions. But obviously, if there's a question like I just did after somebody else's question, then yes, obviously indicate. Right, the third question is Councillor Evans, and I'm hoping Councillor Keaton will help me out if I get it wrong. It's in relation to 2.2 in the report. Why are people only asked to consider biodiversity in planning applications? And there needs to be a stronger message. Oh, sorry, there needs to be a stronger message. Also, what checks are done on the green infrastructure assessments when submitted?
Thank you. Yeah, the word consider, when I read this one, coming from a planning background, certainly, the word consider is very commonly used in the planning process. Biodiversity is a material consideration in the determination of planning applications. Matters such as highways, pollution, residential amenity, visual amenity are also material considerations. So the word consider, in my mind, it depends on what you see, what you think consider means, but this is what I suspect I mean about it. So I'll bring some clarification on that. So during the assessment of a planning application, there are a range of factors that needs to be considered, weighed up and balanced against each other. So since each planning application is assessed on its own merits in context of policies, guidelines and a unique set of circumstances with that site, the weight afforded to that relevant material consideration will very much depend on that particular scheme. So for example, the regeneration and economic development benefits of a scheme may outweigh other factors such as lack of parking. In other scenarios, the need to protect biodiversity and environmental attributes of the site may outweigh the ability to build houses. It's then that balancing of all those material considerations. So in the context of paragraph 2.2, the report explains that Planning Policy Wales has been strengthened to give more weight to biodiversity in the determination of planning applications, and the need to provide ecological enhancements, for example. And this is something that the planning department secures in almost every planning approvals. So if you read a planning report, there'll certainly be a section there about green infrastructure. Well, the most recent ones anyway, certainly since the adoption of the new Planning Policy Wales, there'll be a section there about green infrastructure and ecology biodiversity. And most often than not, you will see a condition there which secures ecological enhancements. With regards to green infrastructure, that's something fairly new that's been introduced through Planning Policy Wales. And it's another method of improving biodiversity. So the message given to applicants, agents and developers who engages us with the planning process is broadly aligned with that of Welsh Government planning policy. In terms of your second aspect of your question relating to the green infrastructure statements and who polices it, it is something new that planning officers, as I mentioned, would have to grasp and assess. Planning Policy Wales does emphasise that such statements has to be proportionate to the scale and nature of the development and will describe how green infrastructure has been incorporated into the proposal. So in the case of minor developments, this will be a short description and should not be onerous requirement for applicants. Those words are in Planning Policy Wales. So planning officers are capable of assessing minor proposals, such as householder development, which forms the bulk of the applications that come through the planning department. But on larger and more complicated sites, consultation often takes place with the council's landscaping and green infrastructure team leader, and as well with the council's ecologist to determine their adequacy. So there is an element there of checks and balances, but they range from officer who's a planning trained to deal with the minor ones, but more complicated schemes do have consultation with various stakeholders. I hope that answered this question.
Thank you. Councillor Keaton?
Yes, two considerations. How much can you police consideration? Because they can say, well, we looked at this, we looked at that, but we couldn't do it, so move on. It sounds like there's not much really holding them back. And the other thing is, if such important things such as SUDS is down to landscape people, what sort of qualifications do these people have, and are they up to date? Are they going to be, are they questioned on that? Because if you've got somebody who doesn't understand sustainable drainage and putting it in around these new buildings, you might not have the checks and balances that you really want, because they'll go, oh yes, we'll do it, and it's not up to standard, it's not up to scratch. Right, thank you.
Question.
Okay. Well, in terms of checking the, in terms of consideration, who balances that? I guess the skill of a planning officer is to weigh up all the issues. And some of you may be members of the planning committee as well. It is a difficult task sometimes when you're presented with all material considerations before you. The decision maker then needs to decide, well, which ones should be prioritized in this particular case, and which ones should be. That is something that you can't put a hard and fast rule on, because each site will have its own set of unique circumstances. So, for example, if you're developing in a site of scientific importance, like a SSSI, for example, then most likely you would give more weight to the environmental and biodiversity credentials of that site over something else. But if you're not in that ecological constraints areas, then you may decide to give more weight to other factors. Again, without knowing the scale and nature of the scheme that's before you, it is very difficult to do that. I guess as officers, we have to at least acknowledge what are those material considerations, but the balance of that and the weighting given to it will very much depend on the unique circumstances. The planning officer and the planning committee will have to have regard to all material considerations, but the weight afforded to that will very much depend on the circumstances. Going on then to the SUDS aspect of it, yes, we do have a landscape architect who is the lead for green infrastructure comments in the planning department. Without knowing her credentials, so to speak, she is a qualified landscape architect and she does feed into that process. It would be very difficult for perhaps a landscape architect to have the same engineering detail as perhaps a qualified drainage engineer would expect to have. But it is something that is very much on the forefront of an overall designing of a scheme, that these days you can't just tag on green infrastructure and landscaping right on SUDS right at the very end. It's very much now an integral part of the design strategy for the development. So when applications are presented to us, it's gone through that process, then it'll have to be designed for by engineers standard under the SUDS separate process that's there. And then the landscape architect then can feed into that overall process to see, you know, are the species suitable, are the layout suitable, etc. like that. All of that would form part of the planning process. Okay.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Sarah Keaton? Sorry, Councillor
Yeah.
Keaton.
Yeah, yes, and yes, I do know the landscape architect at the moment, and I know she's had the training and everything, and I have complete faith in her. I just worry that perhaps the next one, if it's not set in stone, that they have to have that training. That's my concern, that it seems to be something that they can do or not do. That was my concern. Thank you for the answers to the questions.
Thank you. The next one is from myself. It's about in 2.10 says it's difficult for planning to have a local policy that does not accord with national planning policy. Can't we put pressure on national government to change policy on all forms of renewable energy, example solar panels? I've noticed, I think a lot of houses now have solar panels on them, but I'm not certain if that's just by communication with builders. I mean, I think our Swansea standard has these, but the all, you know, normal builders that are building privately, what kind of controls do we have, or what can we put in place to encourage any form of renewable energy for their own homes? Because solar panels seems to be the easiest one I could think of as an example.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, most schemes these days will, certainly in large residential developments, you will see solar panels being fitted on. As I understand it, it's as a result, those solar panels and things like air source heat pumps, they've been brought more forward into the development as a result of changes in building regulation standard. And obviously, when you raise the energy efficiency standards of a dwelling, then you need to explore the technology that's out there, and they feed into the planning process, where the plans that you see before you will include things like solar panels and air source heat pumps. But that is a reaction to changes in non-planning legislation, which is building regulations. And to be honest, I think the situation will probably, this is my thoughts, I think the situation will just go from strength to strength in that aspect, where things like your vehicle charging points and things like that. At the moment, it's not a government requirement, certainly in planning terms, that every dwelling must have solar panels or electric charging points, but they are mainly, you will see it through probably building regulations first, and then planning will fall after. Okay.
Thank you. Do you want to say anything else?
No, I think I totally agree with that. I think it is driven, I think financially driven, particularly with energy costs, but I totally agree that will come, and I think good practice at the moment. I know a lot of the larger developments are actually including electric charging points. But I do agree. I think it will become a statutory obligation, in my opinion, going forward. It's not there yet, but it definitely will be.
Okay, thank you. The next question is Councillor Evans again. I think I remember what his point was trying to make. When looking at planning applications, how much consideration is given to wider issues of water capacity and water treatment for the area as a whole? And I think he was trying to think of water treatment, and I know we had an issue a few years ago with the treatment works at Gowerton, and we could approve them, but they couldn't start work. So because we've got big sites coming online, the question was really, is there, I know they're a statutory consultee, and not question perhaps for you, but maybe you can answer, what, you know, reassurance have we got that if we approve these applications, there's not going to be some kind of, you know, difficulty further down the line?
Yeah, it seems to be that, you know, sewage capacity and things like that is quite very much in the news these days, where you see releases being done to this to the rivers and seas. Yeah, that is a system where we are at the moment. But what is actually trying to improve the situation is that when we allocate development in things like LDPs and whatever it is, you will have Welsh Water, for example, engaging in that process. So if land is being allocated in potentially allocated in a plan where there'll be new residential development, for example, then to work out whether or not that site is capable and should be allocated in a plan, there will be engagement with Welsh Water, who will tell us what are the capacities of waste treatment plants in certain areas. In certain parts of Swansea, there are areas where there is a requirement to actually remove surface water from the combined sewage sewers. So you will get a bit of a net benefit, so that these sewers are safeguarded for sewage discharges only, and not for surface water discharge. Because the problem, I think, at the moment with many of our aging infrastructure in terms of sewage is that they are combined sewers, where you've got surface water discharging as well into the same sewer as effluent. And when there's persistent heavy rainfall, for example, they may overflow, causing a public health issue. But to try and mitigate that, they have to release it then into the rivers and the seas, which again has a more widespread environmental issues. So there are processes in place which looks at capacity during the development process, and it starts from the LDP allocations. But even from that, even when we have planning applications on non-allocated sites, depending on their size, we still consult with Welsh Water, who provides comments to us. I've covered the kind of the effluent aspect of it, but I just wanted to give you an example of a very recent planning decision that we had on water connections on, drinking water, for example. There was a development that the council had refused on building a house in a garden of a property. And within that garden, there was a strategic water main. And Welsh Water advised us that that water main served in excess of 9,000 houses. And we refused the application, and the inspector, it was subject to an appeal, and the inspector agreed that there was no clear situation where that water main would be safeguarded as a result of the development. So the application was refused and dismissed on appeal. And one of those reasons was to safeguard water mains, to ensure that there was drinking water available for 9,000 plus properties. So that gives you a kind of a real life example of what happens in the life of a planning application, which involves consultees with statutory consultees on Welsh Water in respect of drainage for both surface water, drinking water and affluent water. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very full answer and very interesting answer. Thank you. Mine is obviously quite simple. When is TAN 15 likely to come into force? How long is the delay now?
With a new minister, we don't know this particular time. I know there's been a lot of work gone on by the authority and WLGA to try to get the bottom of this and try to get a sensible outcome. So at the moment, the jury's out at the moment. So we haven't got an update. But I'm sure once the new minister gets the position, we'll know shortly. I would have guessed. So hopefully we'll know. I think sooner than later. Personally, we can't keep on like this. We need some clarity of a way forward.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure I wasn't putting you on the spot to give me an exact time frame, but yes. Thank you. Right, the last one is from Councillor Evans. What can we do in terms of developers who cut down trees on a large piece of land, and this is prior, then put in a planning application with an ecological report saying there's nothing there? What can we do to stop this, if anything?
Oh, that's a good question, isn't it? Okay. Right, trees protected by tree preservation order but are felled without permission or have exemption status, okay, that is a criminal offence, okay? So that would be investigated by the planning enforcement team in conjunction with the council's tree officer and a legal officer. So that's taking care about the tree preservation order. So for non-protected trees, Chapter 6 of Planning Policy Wales has been revised towards the end of last year, and it's provided clarification on this particular matter that's been raised, and it could be a deterrent for developers essentially. So paragraph 6.4.16 of PPW, if you wanted to make a note of that, it explains that potential applicants should not conduct any preemptive site clearance works before submitting a planning application, as this can make it more difficult for a development proposal to secure a net benefit for biodiversity. Where a site has been cleared prior to development, its biodiversity value should be deemed to have been in as it was before any site investigations or clearance took place. A net benefit for biodiversity must be achieved from that point. In such cases, habitat status will be presumed to be good in the absence of any evidence to the contrary. So to give you an example, if a developer thought, right, I'm going to be putting in a planning application to develop this plot of land, but it's currently constrained with trees and biodiversity. Because clearing land is not necessarily a planning matter in itself, unless they're covered by a tree preservation order, for example. The developer will go ahead to do that if they so wish, but there are risks with that, because Planning Policy Wales now says that when that planning application comes in, we have to take the situation as it was before the clearance took place, not what it is when the application comes in. Now then, that is something that we would have to look on the resources available in terms of the aerial images, maybe any records of biodiversity we have in the area, to understand what was that baseline value of that site before the application comes in. But Planning Policy Wales certainly gives us a little bit more things to consider in that respect. So when ecological surveys comes in, we would expect those ecological surveys perhaps to, yes, acknowledge what's there now, but also acknowledge what was there, so we can take that into account to establish whether or not that poses a significant constraint to how the site or how the developer intends to develop the site. Okay, I hope that kind of covers that question.
Yes, very fully. Thank you very much. And definitely we've learned something there. I'm pleased you could tell us chapter and verse. I'm sure that Liz will put it in the minutes so that we can all keep, you know, a record of it and refer to it. So it was very interesting. Right. I think Councillor Thomas, you had questions?
Yes, thanks, Joe. I've got 3 or 4 questions. I'll try and be quick in answering them so we can work through them. With regards to big applications, often we see the removal of conditions later on. Do you find, does that happen with biodiversity and environmental conditions that are usually set out in the planning process?
Do you want to ask all 4 and then have the answers then, rather than question and answer?
I can do, if that's what you prefer, yeah. Okay, so that's the first one. You mentioned green infrastructure earlier. Is that Swansea Council or is that a Welsh Government policy? And could you give examples of that? In the report, it says that enforcement is a bit of an issue for the council. I'm just wondering, when it comes to things like reporting on biodiversity, I'm thinking of smaller applications rather than large ones, because obviously large ones, it's worth the enforcement officer's time to go out there. But smaller things that we ask for with regards to, for example, an extension where you've asked for a bird box or something like that, is there any way we could put the responsibility on the applicant to sort of send in proof that they've done that rather than having the enforcement officers go out? 4th question is, I think we skirted around it, but with SUDS, how engaged are the SUDS officers with, for example, ponds, and linking some of those applications to biodiversity and having those 2 things linked? And yeah, that's the other questions kind of covered that. So yeah, those are the 4 questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think I made some notes of those questions. So in terms of removing conditions, you'd have to have very good grounds why the condition needs to be removed. I can just give an example of a condition for invasive species, like Japanese knotweed, for example, that there would be a condition there. Say now that an ecological report has been submitted which shows that there is evidence of Japanese knotweed on the site. We would put a condition on there to say that we need details of how they're going to eradicate that Japanese knotweed. Then if somebody came in to remove that condition, for example, we would have to have good grounds to say, well, have they eradicated it? So we would be looking at that information as part of the reasons why they wanted to remove. If the evidence is there to justify its removal, then certainly we would have no sound planning reason to not remove it. But in any case, we have to rely on that evidence, and most often than not, we would be consulting with our, trained ecologists, for example, or Natural Resources Wales, because, as I said, biodiversity does span across a wide range of topics, and depending on who asked for the condition to begin with, not all conditions are recommended just by the planning department of the council. They may be recommended by other consultees which feed into the planning process. So if evidence, for example, if Natural Resources Wales recommended a condition and somebody was wanting to remove that condition, we would be consulting with NRW to determine whether or not they feel that should be removed, and the evidence that goes with that. With regards to green infrastructure, that is very much now a Welsh Government policy. That's ingrained in Planning Policy 12, which is the recent edition. But we were slightly ahead of the game in terms of Swansea Council, because we do have a policy within our LDP which deals with green infrastructure. So it now is very much well and truly embedded at both national and local level. In terms of enforcement, each case will be on its own kind of scenario in terms of a breach. We have a mandatory duty to investigate breaches of planning control when it's brought to our attention. There may be no mandatory duty for us to take action, but we have to at least investigate to determine the nature of any alleged breaches. When it comes to things such as, it depends on the severity of the breaches. Some could be very, very complicated, some of these conditions, which will require liaison with our ecologists and NW, for example. In terms of the actual enforceability of those conditions, we would have to determine, is it in the public interest to enforce? And that could range, regardless of how small or large certain things could be. We still have to consider the public interest aspect of it. In terms of, you mentioned a bat box or a bird box would be put up by it. It's still a binding planning condition on it. And it's still something that we've committed to say that you know, subject to that bird box, bat box being put up, it will comply with the planning process. If they haven't, unfortunately, we don't have that. I guess what you're trying to say is we don't have that resources ability to monitor every site. And we don't always, there is nothing in the legislation which tells us in the planning process when somebody starts a development. Major planning applications, they have to formally notify the planning department when they commence development. And that is written in the legislation, but not for anything that's not major. Anything below that, it is not something that the legislation allows us to have notification of when development has commenced. But in terms of those bat boxes, if it was brought to our attention that a bird bat box had not been put up when it should have been, that is something that we would investigate for the planning process. But I've got to bear in mind that last year, for example, we dealt with around 2,500 planning applications in a year. So if we're putting the bird and bat boxes on almost all of our planning applications, that would mean that the resources available for the council to go on each and every single application, when we don't know when that development has actually commenced development or not, the resources are not there for us to be able to do that. I'm not aware that other local authorities across Wales has that resources to be able to look at matters in that level of detail that quickly. But this is where the scenario where we are. And if it was brought to our attention that there was an alleged breach of planning control, such as not complying to condition, certainly our enforcement team would investigate that. The final aspect was to do with SUDs and biodiversity. Yeah, SUDs is essentially governed under separate planning, separate process to planning, but that is mainly to deal with the engineering and technical details arising from the the need to deal with surface water drainage. But in terms of the biodiversity value of SUDs, certainly that is something that forms part of the planning process by our ecologists, or as I mentioned, our landscape and green infrastructure team leader there that looks at these factors. Yes, again, SUDs can take a range of factors, whether or not it would include on-site measures or off-site measures, how deep certain swales and things would have to be. All of those factors would form part of the overall drainage strategy that's in place for that. And our colleagues in the biodiversity and ecology team and green infrastructure would certainly feed into that process, certainly from a planning perspective. I'm not sure how much they link into SUDs applications, which is a separate to the planning process. That is perhaps not a question for myself to answer, but certainly through the planning process, they do engage on that level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is that all the answers you need, Councillor Thomas, or have you got any more questions?
Yeah, just one follow-up, if you don't mind. Just regarding the, I can understand it's pretty much impossible to get people to report whether they've done their, the biodiversity commitments from the plan application. As you mentioned, the resources are just not there to go around and check every single application, and I totally appreciate that. I'm just wondering if it is worth trying to think of ways that people can, we can sort of enforce it in another way, whether that's through maybe building regulations, because obviously they have to sign off the building regs. Is it some way that we could build it into that, or some kind of voluntary reporting? It would obviously take a little bit of weight off the enforcement team as well, but I'm just wondering if that's a conversation that you've had, or if there's any plans to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll certainly speak to the development manager about whether or not we can, if there's anything else that we can do through the planning process, certainly. I'm not aware that it's not at the moment a building regulations issue in terms of to put bird and bat boxes, for example, or any other form of green infrastructure. It seems to me that Welsh Government wants to make it part of the planning process through the strengthening of Planning Policy Wales. That seems to be the channel that's, that Welsh Government wants to pursue. But I'll certainly speak to the development manager to see how are we getting that balance between enforcing and compliance only conditions, for example, depending on the wording. Yeah, I'll certainly take that away. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, what might just follow up very quickly, what I'm trying to say is, if it's in the planning application, can the building regulations guys just, be wary of it and include it in the regulation sign off? Thank you.
Yeah, I guess building inspectors through the planning regulation process can be aware of it, but I'm not too sure whether or not they are required to, by their own standards and their own legislation. I'm not aware that there is something like that in their guidance. That, for example, I'm not aware that they can't sign off a building through building regs in the absence of any bat boxes or bird boxes, for example, because I don't think that their legislation covers that aspect. But I'll certainly have a look at it from the planning perspective. That's no problem at all.
Thanks. Might be something worth passing further up the tree, I suppose, then into the legislation, maybe. Thanks.
Thank you. Has anybody else got any questions? Councillor Fitzgerald, you're very quiet today. I'm a bit concerned.
I'll make up for it now. Thanks ever so much for the information we've had today. I find it very useful, and it's certainly encouraging that, we are taking the need to protect biodiversity much more seriously than we once were. But I'm afraid, cynic that I am, isn't it inevitable that if a greenfield site is being developed, and let's face it, there are several greenfield sites in Swansea under development at the moment, isn't it inevitable that there is going to be a significant loss of biodiversity that can never really be replaced by anything a developer can do to mitigate? I mean, if you think of the loss of hedgerows, the loss of vegetation, maybe trees because they're in the wrong place. It's certainly something I'm experiencing in my ward, and I'm sure it is an issue potentially across Swansea. I don't know if there's anything reassuring you can give on that, but I think we have to be aware of the reality that the development of greenfield sites is going to have significant impact on biodiversity in a particular area. Thank you.
That's another good question. Okay, yeah. I would go on the basis that greenfield sites being developed are mainly those perhaps would be allocated in a local development plan. Now then, when you allocate a site, there is a degree of commitment there from the plan about developing that. Now then, once that commitment is there, then that's got to be acknowledged that when you know, I mentioned about material considerations, that you've got to balance all things up. When you're dealing with an allocated site, that it's got weight to it in the development plan, and you've got to give weight to the plans and policies. At the end of the day, the development plan is policies that the council has decided to impose and think that this is what is good for Swansea as a whole when you've got allocations. So if that commitment is there in an allocated plan, when a planning officer then has to look at all the considerations associated with that site, the fact that something is an allocation would hold quite a bit of weight in the determination of a planning application. However, that is not to say that that's the end of it in terms of the planning process. It doesn't mean that, you know, biodiversity and ecology goes out to the window, for example. We would still have to evidence what ecological and biodiversity value does that field have. So the planning application may include ecological and biodiversity surveys to inform them what's there. And there may be a process of mitigation, compensation, these factors, and those may result in off-site mitigation or compensation. So for example, if you're developing a greenfield site, there may be other fields that could be enhanced or compensated to provide mitigation as a result of development. That is something that could be explored, but without knowing the facts of each case, it's very difficult for me to say what will work for one site and it may not work for another. But there are a range of factors which would be considered during the processing of a planning application. And I hope that that provides some reassurance that you know, greenfield sites do not get developed without any regard to biodiversity. It's just what weight gives to it may be shifted depending on what policies apply to that particular parcel of land. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that a sufficient answer, Councillor Fitzgerald?
Yes, it was a very good answer, I thought. So well done. Yes, you know, I understand, as do we all, what the development of greenfield sites involve. And I think we have to accept there is a reality about this kind of situation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, everybody. Are there any more questions now before we go on to the next item on the agenda? No. Okay, thank you. So the next item is the work plan. And as you can see, the next meeting, which will be on the 19th of November, is, I should have looked at it. The briefing on the new waste strategy, recycling and water quality management and pollution control. So we're back to water again in the next meeting. Thank you all very much for attending. Thank you both for Eileen, who I think has given us some really good answers and made us understand things a lot more. And thank you, Councillor Hopkins, for attending as well. Thank you very much. I'll see you on the 19th, although we will be having the pre-meeting for questions. If you can't attend, sorry, Liz, can you stop the recording? If you can't attend and you